All right, so the next one here, the U.S. gets involved in a territorial dispute between China and India. So China has hit back at the U.S. for siding with India in a territorial dispute over Arunachal Pradesh, which is a state in northeast India that's claimed by Beijing. Last week, the State Department released a statement saying, quote, the U.S. recognizes Arunachal Pradesh as Indian territory and strongly opposes any unilateral attempts to advance territorial claims by incursion or encroachments, military or civilian, across the line of actual control, end quote. And the line of actual control is a demarcation line separating Chinese-controlled and Indian-controlled territory, and they have some disputed territory in different parts of the border. Arunachal Pradesh is in the northeast, and the areas where they've had clashes over the past few years, most notably in 2020, if you remember, in the summer, or it was June 2020, there was a clash between Chinese and Indian troops, and 20 Indian troops were killed and 4 Chinese were killed. That was in the west, west of Arunachal Pradesh, but if you look at a map of India, in the north. So India bases its claims to Arunachal Pradesh on what they call the McMahon Line, which was a boundary agreed upon by the British and Tibet in 1914 without China's input. China briefly controlled this territory after the 1962 Sino-Indian War, but it ceded the territory and withdrew back to that line that was drawn by the British Empire. So China responded to the U.S. making this statement, wading into this territorial dispute, and said, quote, China strongly deplores and firmly opposes this. The China-India boundary question is a matter between the two countries and has nothing to do with the U.S. side, end quote. So the reason why I wanted to cover this is because since that fight between Chinese and Indian troops in the Galwan Valley along the line of actual control, up high in the Himalayan mountains, very far from the U.S., since that clash, and the Chinese and Indian troops deployed to these areas don't have guns. It was with like bats and clubs that they fought with. Since then, the U.S. and India have really increased their military ties. And one thing that the U.S. did was they signed this intelligence sharing agreement in October 2020 called the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement. And that allowed the U.S. to share satellite data with India. That helps India, the U.S. helps India with surveillance of Chinese troops along this border. And there was a report in U.S. News last year that said in December 2022, there was another clash between Chinese and Indian troops. And during that, the U.S. shared intelligence, basically helped India by sharing intelligence. And this is something I just think so few people are aware of, that this is always a risk of a war between India and China, two nuclear-armed powers. And the U.S. has gotten itself pretty involved with helping India with intelligence. And there's also been, the U.S. has been doing military drills in this area. And again, this is an area near where the clashes were, the western part of the line of actual control, which is basically think of it as the border between India and China. So it's just an area that I like to keep an eye on. And now you see the U.S. coming out strongly backing India in this territorial dispute with China. And another thing, since that 2020 clash, that's when India really started joining kind of the U.S. in these anti-China alliances and military drills with the Quad and things like that. It really soured relations between China and India.